That's a big part of it. We're also actually taking some of the savings that will result from downgrading the penalties on some of these offenses and creating a new penalty for sales to minors, because we see that that's one of the things that is missing from the current scheme. We're a little too harsh on simple possessions, and we're missing an opportunity to really try to intervene in suppliers, drug dealers that are pushing drugs on our kids. And so that's a place we want to get tougher. It's a rebalancing of our priorities, and again, rebalancing some of our resources and directing them to evidence-based treatment alternatives that work.
This sounds like this happens every 2 decades. Would I be about right? It seems like we have to dust off these rules and go, yeah, we need to tweak it a little bit more here, we need to tweak a little bit more there. Is this, how close are we?
Well, the pendulum may be swinging the other way from when it was when we were tough on crime and 3 strikes you're out and mandatory minimums. Again, I don't think so. I think we're being smarter. Public safety is still our #1 objective.
Is a mandatory minimum a good idea? You're a prosecutor. I mean, having a mandatory minimum, I kind of like that idea. I want to let people know that if you commit this crime, you're going to get this.
I'll tell you, for me it depends on what the mandatory minimum is, what flexibility I have as a prosecutor, what kind of flexibility the judge has as a judge to be a judge. To me, that's what it boils down to. I think, for example, in our violent crime statutes, we have mandatory minimums. If you commit a second-degree assault, which is a Class 4 felony, that's a mandatory minimum 4 years in prison. I think that, a mandatory minimum 5 years in prison. I think that's a well and good and great statute to have on the books. But as a prosecutor, if I think I'm going to have a problem proving my case, I have the flexibility to plead that to something else. In that circumstance, I believe a mandatory minimum is a great thing. In some of these other circumstances, where I don't have the flexibility to plea bargain my case in another way, where literally the judge or the prosecutor doesn't have flexibility to move forward with a case, I don't think mandatory minimums in that circumstance are a good thing.
So this changes some of that. Let's talk about the politics. What's going to be the hang-up here? We're getting hardcore Republicans. We're getting the Attorney General here in Colorado. We're getting groups like mine. We're getting squishy little Democrats like you, all excited about the same thing. It always makes me a little queasy when there's all this consensus going on and we all seem to say the same thing. It makes me want to reevaluate my point of view. Is this a political reality? Is it going to happen?
I think it is, and I don't think you need to reevaluate your point of view. I think you're right, and consensus is
finally... Pardon me if I don't take your point of view on it.
I think consensus has finally, come together around this issue. I think this is the right time. It's the right issue. We have gone through an elaborate process of having all the stakeholders buy into this. And, as I said, there's no time like a budget crisis for an opportunity to relook at how you're doing things and get smarter.
Then what's the hang-up here? What's going to be the pitfall?
Well, and I'll say, we didn't just wake up one day and end up at this point. I mean, this has been a really hard-fought battle from every side of the issue to countless meetings and discussions and countless players and subject matter experts at the table coming to these conclusions. So this has been a very hard-fought battle from both sides, from the Democrats versus Republicans, prosecutors versus defense attorneys. This has been extremely well vetted. I think that there are some potential pitfalls here, though.
Let's talk about the Gov for one. Now, the Gov is a former DA. He knows this stuff. He's been there, and he's been the DA of Denver. Not quite as nasty as Colorado Springs when it comes to crime, of course. But I'm curious, is the governor going to be a problem? Is he supportive of this? How do we know?
I'm quite frankly, I'm a little bit nervous about the governor's support on this bill. Well, I think that there are some provisions in this that listen, this is the governor's commission that we sit on. The CCJJ is the governor's commission that we sit on. And he hasn't, to this point, to my knowledge, come out in support of recommendations from his commission. That makes me nervous. I believe when we're stepping out politically here, and certainly this is stepping out for my side, it's really a paradigm shift from my side, but I believe the governor needs to be on board, and the governor needs to show his support from day one. He doesn't need to sign on to this thing after it gets through the House and after it gets through the Senate. He needs to be on board now.
And he's not?
We haven't
why
heard
isn't
that
it?
yet.
This was a commission where the governor appointed people. His Department of Public Safety staffs this commission and has a number of seats at the table in this whole process. And so I think his administration has been well represented and has their fingerprints all over this.
Well,
Does that mean he's going to support this? Because you guys know the inner workings under the Gold Dome much better than I. But it seems to me if the governor is signaling support for a bill or an issue, that's going to move it along because you know he's going to sign it. Rather than, for instance, last year when he vetoed a union bill and everyone was on all sides seemed to be angry with him.
I mean, you should have the governor on your show, John.
Oh,
but
good God Almighty! We've asked every month for 3 years now. The previous governors always came on.
His administration is very busily right now looking for bill sponsors and revising bill drafts of all of the recommendations that have gone through this process. And so, you know,
So you're
this
not
was
worried?
their commission. No, I'm not. But I'm not here to speak for him. I'm here as one of the sponsors of the bill, as someone who spent last summer sitting on this drug policy task force.
Did you get any free drugs on the policy task force?
No, but we did some interesting interviews with people in the field wanting to talk about the quantities of things people possess for personal use versus for being in the business.
So you both know how to cook meth, is that right?
No, sir.
We're visiting the medical marijuana dispensaries tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
So that's,
I've already
We've
done
only,
that.
we've only got a couple more minutes here. So let me ask you the what seems like an underlying question. Are you guys afraid or encouraged one way or the other that this might lead to a larger discussion on the recreational use of drugs? Is it time that, you know, between what you guys are doing now with medical marijuana, trying to put some reins on that, you know, is this spurring any conversation saying, wait a second, maybe some of these things ought to be above board and taxed to pay for these, this treatment?
I'll tell you, John, that's something that hasn't been on my radar scope. I haven't been thinking about that at all. I've been thinking about how can we best spend our public safety dollar. And
Are people worried that this is where it's going to lead, though? If we have
so.
sentencing reform, well, that means we're soft on crime, and therefore we're going to legalize.
I don't think so.
No, it just means we're being smarter on crime, and we're doing more with the resources we have.
I think this is, however, a first step. There were a lot of things on the table through this drug policy task force process that we decided were too much to take on in this first year. Looking at some of these low-level distributors who are dealing drugs to feed their own habit, not drug kingpins, not part of cartels, but just low-level petty drug dealers. And we couldn't get to consensus to take on that piece this year. That's going to be the next bite at the apple. But I don't think legalization is necessarily where this process leads. That's a different discussion that I don't think is going to emanate from this commission.
All right, so this is sentencing reform, plain and simple. We're going to save some money. We're going to keep our community safe. Left and right tend to like it.
Sure, and I'll tell you, I think we're going to have a tough fight next year when that comes around.
Representative, Senator, thank you so much, and thank you. Take a listen to some of our great podcasts on iVoices.org. Get all the information you need from independenceinstitute.org. And listen for me late nights on 850 KOA. We'll see you next week.
You jabba jab, bamboozle, nuka noozle, bippity bop, she-gall. You jabba jab, bamboozle, nuka noozle, bippity bop, she-gall. I mean, you keep on talking, but you don't know where to turn it off.